let's see what happens. Sorry. Oh, that was recording then. Oh, this could be interesting. Hello, and welcome to starting slightly early, so we'll probably start off with a bit of a chat before we get going, because we usually start at 7 o'clock, and it's currently 3 minutes to. What could have been learned if Billy Mitchell had followed the rules in 1921? Now, I'm going to start off with like my constant these days, and I will keep on doing this. Because I thought we'd been successful. I thought keep explaining that they were live when a video was live and saying it was a live video would stop those who were upset, or rather do not seem to enjoy lives because of the level of interaction with the chat, etc. Which I can accept. If that's not you, that's not you. That's fine. I thought pausing that was going to be enough to stop them being upset and basically let them be happy. But apparently it wasn't. Apparently it wasn't. So, I'm just going to say again, this is going to be a live video. There will be interaction with the chat. Normally I do say hello to people when they join a YouTube video and start saying something in the chat, because I like to be friendly with the chat. I do find it interesting when people say, this must reflect poorly on you when you're a university lecturer. I'm not sure if you quite sure about this, but YouTube videos, unlike university lecturers, people can come and go at any time they choose. In a university lecture, you have a start time, a timetable, and students turn up for that, and usually some lecturers have a policy of locking the door within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 15 minutes of the time starting, and then no one else is allowed in. Also, you usually have several hundred students in a lecture. This is why I often say YouTube lives are not run like lectures, they're run like seminars, where I normally have 20 or 30 students coming in. And yes, I will say hello to them individually, because if you're in a room with 20 to 30 students every week for a year for at least an hour, it's kind of nice to know their names. It's kind of the sort of respectful way you teach them, as a rule. So, yeah, I have often said I run these like I do my seminars. So that's why I interact with the chat. But as I said, that seems to upset some people, and so I say, this is going to be a live video. I'm going to be interacting in the chat. If you don't enjoy that, please, if you still want to watch the videos, watch Long Patrols, the recorded videos. And if you still find my videos boring, the question I have to ask is, why are you watching them? We're on YouTube. There are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of channels to pick from. Why would you pick one that bores you? It seems... I don't want it to come across as rude, because it's not, but the word I would use is asinine. When I'm looking for something to do in my free time, I don't go to the place that's going to bore me. I go to the place that's going to stimulate and interest me. And not all I've spent years in university, and there are some very good academics who lectures I could not stand to be in, because their style just doesn't gel with me. And there are others, lecturers who I completely disagree with, but who actually I enjoy the lectures of, because their style really is the style which I enjoy listening to and being part of. So we're all different folks. We all have different strokes, for want of a better phrase. Embrace it. Go where you're happy. Don't stay where you're not. Anyway, so... And also, this is the other thing, university lecturers and university sort of videos. One of the things I will say, when I'm giving a lecture in a university, I have a timetable I have to keep to, and I do keep to it, and I do present within that timetable. When I'm recording a video, even a recorded video, I can do this magical thing if I have an idea while I'm recording it. I can pause, I can edit, I can add in extra stuff. occasionally I can change my verbiage as I'm speaking, and this occasionally just means I pause. I might be pausing for you to consider things, or I might be pausing because the word I was going to use that's in my notes is not the word I want to use, because I think there's a better one for it, a more accurate one. I realise this means occasionally I speak a bit slow. Don't worry. I'm trying to make sure I'm using the correct words and imparting what I want to impart. So, Raptor, I really dislike teachers locking the door. I've never bothered to lock the doors. Actually, no, I tell a lie. I have locked the doors, but that's when I'm doing when I'm doing lectures which are there is going to be a health and safety risk in a certain part of the theatre, and then I basically go, right then, we're starting this. I'm now going to lock the doors at the front. The doors at the back are open. The doors at the front are locked because whilst you can exit them, you can't come into them, so people can't walk into the experiment. So yes, I have locked the doors. I'm saying I hadn't locked the doors would be a lie. But, yes, I have locked doors, but that was because to stop people wandering into the middle of an experiment. If you're wondering what a historian was doing, experimenting with stuff which was dangerous enough that they should stop people wandering into it, well, I taught history of engineering, and I was the guy who occasionally got to blow up engines. If you get the mixture just right going into certain old air engines, you can make the valves pop off. It's fun. It is really fun. So, let's say hello to everyone. Hello, Knight 681. I see you've already got some questions. Hello, Peter Dawson. Hello, Mark Agnes. Hello, Timo Locker. Hello, Michael Hooch. Hello, John Shea. Hello, Matthias Slavic. Hello, Paul Amos. Hello, StephenMeier. Hello, Roy Finker. Hello, DG40. Hello, The Brock. Hello, Steve Richards. Hello, Useful D. Hello, Raptorat. Hello, Gokbay. Hello. Hi, Steve Clarke. Hello, Raptorat. Hello, Carl Gasberg. Hello, Stephen Richards. Hello, Leslie Mitchell. Hello, Blackman Maximus. And hello, everyone. Yeah, if Drac was doing his Greek fire experiment inside, you could guarantee the doors closest to that experiment would be locked for people coming in from the outside. Hello, Ken Maguire. So, there's an interesting discussion going on. Do you think they'd have used a radio-controlled ship, target ship? Not realistically at this point, because not for these tests. You see, there are scenarios where you would use radio-controlled ships for attacking, especially if you're shelling and you're trying to train your crews to do gunnery practice against moving targets, and if you're trying to do air attack versus moving targets when you're training the crews. These were damage assessment tests. That's the thing. They're about assessing the damage caused by weapons. There is, therefore, not an onus on the ship to be moving or anything. It's literally just there to be hit at, so they can then go and look and go, ooh, this is the damage it caused. What's it done? How's it done this? That's literally what they're looking at. Hello, Jacob. Good luck at sea. Hello, Victor Amand. Hi, thank you. Hello, Abzaski. Hello, Carlos Rodriguez. And hello, Duncan Campbell. Hello, everyone. So, this is going to be a fun one. I will say this. This is going to be a fun video. I would say Billy Mitchell is an interesting character for me because when I did my PhD thesis years ago, and I was looking at development of naval aviation, one of the things when I was looking, especially the American side of it, was the fact that one of the biggest people proposing against aircraft carriers and arguing against aircraft carriers, and arguing against aircraft carriers being used to attack Pearl Harbor, was Billy Mitchell. His entire view was strategic bombing. And the reason it came up was, as my PhD thesis was originally, structured, I was going to do America and Japan as well as the Britain, but that just grew too big. But secondly, it was at one point him, Trenchard, and to an extent Gideon Duhay, but he's always almost a passive, passive active member of this conversation, because he puts out his ideas and puts out his thoughts, but doesn't really listen to what anyone else is saying. So it's kind of a I'm going to make this statement and I'm going to affect the world, but I'm not going to listen to what anyone else is saying, and that then interacts and bats around. So it's kind of like you have three ping pong players around a table in terms of their big names for development of aviation theory. And there are a lot of others around the table as well, but these are the three big names. And two are constantly building up the rally between each other, and occasionally the third one just gets in and adds an extra, shot into it, but then doesn't actually take any part. It's fun. It is fun. And so, the question we have here is, what could have been learned if Billy Mitchell had followed the rules in 1921? And I have lots of discussions about this. I have lots of points about this. But we also have to consider why he broke the rules and why the rules were established in the first place. And to do that, I'm going to use the Billy Mitchell story. I'm basically going to use his history to discuss that. Because one of the things you have to remember about Billy Mitchell is he is... See, in those times we'd call him a proponent. And the historians look back at this. But realistically, if I was going to describe him best, I'd say he's an activist. And not only that, he's a purist of an activist. Not only does he believe the ends justify the means, he believes in that ideologically pure approach of totality of air power. And this is what caused it to be a really interesting scenario, and probably one of the reasons why people keep going, oh, we've got to reward him for having been right. And yet, basically the average summation from people is that that sort of goes on him is that he was, whilst he might have been vindicated in some views, he certainly wasn't vindicated in all of them, and especially not the most extreme of them. But he was guilty of lying. And that's what he was charged with. So before we get into this, his specifications of the charge were about him lying about the air security and defense of Hawaii and various other things. And it was shown to be not the case. It was verified not to be the case. He was arguing that the air service had suffered in Hawaii out of all proportion, wasn't getting funded, and actually was shown to be getting more funds than quite a lot of the other sections. He was trying to say the conclusions were one way, and then they were reported a different way, and actually the conclusions were a far more nuanced approach. Basically, in 1923, if someone is concluding that coastal artillery is more accurate and more likely to do damage, but air attacks have a longer range, and if the weather, etc., and situation is with them, the air attacks can deliver a decisive blow against the enemy, that doesn't really sound unfair. And this is the big problem with quite a lot of the proponents in this period. They have such a vision of what air power's going to be. They can't accept that anyone's going, yes, but it's not there yet. And we saw this recently, actually, because there's someone going around, and I'm not going to name names, who suggests that if the Japanese had built 16 carriers instead of their battleships, then they would have been able to win the Pacific War, or at least survive it better. the real scenario here is they base that on their number of capital ships they build. So pretty much they'd have had to been building carriers instead of dreadnoughts. In fact, earlier than that to get there. And if you turned around to someone in 1906 and you said you were going to build an aircraft carrier rather than a dreadnought, you would be laughed at because, quite honestly, you are talking stupidity. Because aircraft in 1906 are not what they are in 1914 and nowhere what they are in 1944. And this is the basic problem you have with a lot of some of the revisionist approaches to history. In that, A, they are looking back and they are trying to presume the people then should have known what we know now. And also they are looking back and going, well, you know, it worked out this way eventually 20 years later. They should have known that 20 years in advance. I'm not getting into it. There's been enough of a Twitter kerfuffle over it, and frankly, I'm not in the business of using my platform to bash people. But I'm just using it as an example, because this is what happens. And it's usually, when that does happen, in most cases, because people are trying to make the case for things today. They're trying to make the case and argue for something today. And the trouble is, if your argument has to be, how do I put this? If your argument to get any traction has to be rested on a false premise, that suggests there's a basic fundamental issue with your argument in the first place. Well, the point I'd make to anyone, and I'd go for anyone you've done this, but if the Japanese had built 16 aircraft carriers in that period, don't we all think the British and the Americans would have responded? They also said that if the Germans had built aircraft carriers instead of capital ships, they could have won the war in the Atlantic. And it's a case of, well, if the Germans had started cranking out aircraft carriers instead of the Deutschlands and the Scharnhorsts and the Bismarcks, what do we think the Royal Navy would have done in response? Crank out aircraft carriers, anyone? You know, that's the problem. None of changing what you're building doesn't change the basic problem all those nations have. Infrastructure and the ability to use it. And where were they going to get it? With the yes, that was the other problem. It's the training and the air crew and all the other things. There's all sorts of issues with it as an idea. But the point is this: you will get both from people looking backwards and people at the time imagining aircraft as they could be, as they were once time moved on. And the trouble is, that's not as it was. And you can be an absolute visionary and go, well, I predict a future when aircraft are going to be like this. That doesn't justify you making false arguments and falsifying data and lying when it happens to try and make your case. Did you mock them? No, I didn't get involved in it at all because, look, I have a policy when it comes to social media and all these things. If I can have an argument with you to your face, then I will say things to you on social media. If I can have an argument with you to your face, or, you know, that sort of scenario. If I don't know you well enough to have an argument with you to your face, and have a discussion with you to your face, and by argument, I don't mean shouting, swearing, or being rude, or slinging personal insults. I mean actually having a argument, as in the sense of you put forward your side, I put forward my side, and debating it. Then I will happily have the discussion with you on social media. If I can't do that with you in real life, I'm not going to do that with you on social media. because it's disingenuous, and I'm setting up a situation, especially as quite a lot of my academic colleagues, let's be honest, I am not a big person on social media. I have, 11,000, nearly 900 subscribers on YouTube. I have, I don't know, who knows how many on Twitter, etc. Yet still, compared to quite a lot of my colleagues, I am able to ratio them. That doesn't set it up for a fair argument. That doesn't set it up for a fair fight. And I'm not in the business of being elephant boots. I have better things to do with my time. So, what could have been learned if Billy Mitchell had followed the rules in 1921? Well, that's going to be an interesting discussion we're going to get to. But first of all, shameless book plug. Hello, Richard Gus. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Hey, Michael. Every time please note, this is the thing is, every time the kitchen, there is something that goes wrong in our kitchen, or my sister has an accent, but she's getting far better at cooking lately. I did see someone make a comment recently, and I went, I have to be honest, she is getting better. My mum has been helping her, and she's been getting a lot better. I can always tell, because a random McDonald's drink will show up for me, or some chicken nuggets. I am currently expecting to get a delivery of food at some point this evening because of that. Because I've seen what my sister's attempting this evening, and okay, it might go right, but I also might end up with a drink and some chicken nuggets delivered at some point this evening. Just a heads up, everyone. Is there any difference between the first and second edition Tribals, Battles, and Airings? There is, in that I fixed the tables and a few other points in between the first and second edition. I'm not able to add, until enough books have copied have sold, I'm not able to do a third edition where I'm able to add in whole new chapters. It wasn't quite that bad, StephenMeier. Now, Tribals, Battles, and Airings. I really liked it. It's the book I turned to after my PhD thesis, after I was told, when I was trying to publish it, that there wasn't enough market for another aircraft carrier book, especially not one which was looking into the nuts and bolts in the 1920s and 30s and not spending enough time on World War II or World War I. Yeah, honestly, they just didn't feel it was an economic market. The universal response from the publishers, and I went round about 25 of them, was, we liked the book, we enjoyed reading it, we don't think there's a market for it because it's all in 20s and 30s and no one's really interested in that. They're interested in World War I and World War II. And honestly, if you look at how I had to shift around TBD, you'll notice that thanks to the battles and the darings, I basically structured it around World War II in the middle, but managed to get in all the rest around it of the post-war and the pre-war stuff around it, so that it could go through. I like it. I think it's a good book, and thank you to everyone who's bought it, and thank you to everyone who's considering buying it, because as an academic in the UK, the only way we get promoted is by book sales and journal articles. And, well, no one's going to advertise it but me, so hence the shameless book plugs. And thank you to everyone who likes, shares, and subscribes to the videos. My constant refrain is, it may not be a communicable disease, the love of naval history, but I sure do my best to try and make it so. Oh, the reason it's always a McDonald's is because my lovely mum has a mild addiction to their apple pies. When I say a mild addiction to the apple pies, if it's not hot enough, good Lord help the manager of that McDonald's. She actually explained to one once the process of how it's supposed to be good. Oh, which sounds like a massive, rudeness on her part. But please note, he'd said, well, We can't do the apple pie at the moment because no one here knows how to operate the apple pie machine. And my mother literally talked him through it. And he was going, how do you know how to do this? Where did you learn? What kind of savant are you about the apple pie machine? Her exact words, her response were, you study what you love. What would the third edition chapters be? Content be? They'd be on the Australian and the Canadian ships, especially as I've now visited them. Jacob, isn't that just basically the oven? You'd think it's just the oven. There is certain settings and things which have to be set up for it, and they weren't sure what to do because the person who normally did their apple pies was ill. And the manager didn't know. So first question, and this was what I got when I said I was doing a video about Billy Mitchell, was which Billy Mitchell was it? Because someone said, so how did the pro gamer have anything to do with aircraft development? Which I found quite intriguing. And another couple of people said the EastEnders character. And, well, let's see. The one we're talking about today is this one. We're talking about this Billy Mitchell. We're talking about the gentleman who was a US Army officer, an air power proponent, who, as early as 1906, predicts that a future conflicts will all take place in the air, not on the ground. This is whilst as an instructor at the Army Signal School. I'm not sure why that didn't endear him to his Army superiors. But, again, let's start thinking about that. That's his starting position in 1906, before he's learnt to fly before anything. If you consider modern warfare, which has got as advanced as it has, and we are talking over 118 years since he made that statement, has anyone noticed something about modern warfare? Are there no more ground troops or warships involved in modern warfare? Well, anyone noticed that? Drakenred, frankly, mentioning the bacon fried pie in Japan is a terrible thing to do because that's just going to make Drak and a fair number of the rest of the shipshape team trying to get out there earlier. We all want to know how the pro gamer influenced into war aircraft design, but basically, apologies, today's video isn't about either of these personalities. Now, the thing is, you have this trouble with people who become very obsessed with certain ideas, and they often do push forward the world. Often their obsession does become a driving force, and if they're an effective communicator, they can really propel the world forward. So in that way, they're great. But I can talk about this in the case of Jackie Fisher. If you consider the mantra of not a pound to air to ground, which was used for the F-22 at one point, Jackie Fisher's would be not a pound to armor, everything to speed and guns. But the reality was, the resulting ship was actually the fast battleship, once you go down the Dreadnought scale. And that has quite a lot of armour and subdivision and things to give it survivability due to fighting, whilst also having the speed and the firepower. It's the combination of the lot. And the air power proponents, including Billy Mitchell, who strongly believed the future would be all aviation, didn't miss the fact that usually what happens is the rest of the forces adapt, and aviation becomes part of the mix. Maybe an important part, maybe a critical part, but it becomes part of the mix of a war, not replacing the other bits. In fact, this is the point I'm often trying to make and often explaining. what you see more often than not in military affairs and in military warfighting with new technology is not revolution, but evolution. And evolution very rarely destroys whole chunks of things. It usually adapts and different things fill certain niches. It is different. It is not. It doesn't wipe out. Revolutions wipe out what's gone before. Evolutions add on to what's happened before. Oh, Knight 681, do not start giving Jackie Fisher credit for the aircraft carrier. Please don't, because, again, that's another one I can point to who was a huge issue. Actually, by the time it got to the 1920s, instead of talking about aircraft carriers, he was talking about balloon bombers and battleships of the sky. So, yeah, just we'll leave Jackie Fisher's air power theories for another day. Maybe a long time in the future when I am settled in a place where I have got an oven where I can do a non-stop supply of basically chicken nuggets or something like that, and I've got a fridge full of iron brew, and yeah, I will need to do a whole other donathon for that discussion, just to pay for the iron brew necessary to have the discussion. John South, the answer is always more combined arms. It is. It has been forevermore. I remember having chats about Alexander the Great, people going, oh, it was his cavalry, that was his decisive arm. No, it was his phalanx that was his decisive arm. No, it was his skirmishers that were his decisive arm. And I'm going, no, it's the fact he used all three. That's his decisive arm. He doesn't go, oh, I can use that, or that, or that. He thinks about how he's best going to use all his forces at his disposal to win the battle. And it has been forevermore throughout history. That has been the one guiding principle of history. People who focus on just one thing tend to come a cropper. People who bring the whole force together to work as one. So instead of going, this strand's my strongest, everything will go in that, and that's what's going to do all my attacks, so I'm going to poke on them. They go, let's weld all these strands, including this really strong strand, together into this, and then pump. Because, let's be honest, which wins a fight? Finger versus fist? Me putting all force in, I can. Time for a repeat. This is a live chat. Yes, this is a live with chat, by the way. And says, wait, Jackie Fisher has said that it's yeah. Don't get me started on Jackie Fisher's airpad. It's a lot of interesting stuff. So you also have to remember, Billy Mitchell is a ardent self-publicist. And one of the officers most often cited for saying how great he is a guy called General MacArthur. Another ardent self-publicist. Look, MacArthur's similarity in his defense of Billy Mitchell probably also comes back to the fact that he was removed under similar circumstances. And he didn't like the idea of a senior officer should not be silenced for being at variance with superiors in rank and with accepted doctrine. That isn't the case, though. In both scenarios, that isn't the reason they're being kicked out. You can argue against doctrine. You can argue against those things. That's fine. But when you do so, you better be arguing from a position of honesty and truth. Because if you start doing any colouring outside the lines, if you start doing any sort of case of, you know what, I'm going to present this information in a very specific light, you can sort of get away with that. If it's, I'm going to rewrite this information and rewrite what happened to suit my argument, you're going to get into trouble. Because the reason you get into trouble in an armed forces scenario, and in a civilian scenario, you get sued for libel. In an armed forces scenario, if you are calling into question other officers' honour, you can find yourself in a court-martial. If you are found to have been the one lying, and they are actually honest, then you lose your position, because you have lied about what they've said. That is the scenario we are talking about. MacArthur is kicked out for basically presuming that he could tell the elected president of the United States what to do, that he was senior to everyone. At that point, this is the scenario here you have to have done with MacArthur is, how do I put this politely? The US Navy has a rank of Fleet Admiral, of course, which is the 5-star equivalent. And the General of the Army rank is the 5-star equivalent, I think, for MacArthur. Yeah, for the US Army. So MacArthur has made it on the 18th of December, 1944. So you either have to find George C. Marshall to give him an order, because he's the only one who precedes him on the 16th of December, 1944. If he's not, he's the can give MacArthur an order. Or technically, William D. Leahy and Ernest King all could technically give orders to MacArthur, but you have to call them back to service to do that. And that was the trouble with MacArthur. He outranked everyone else who was left in service. Or you end up with the opposite and have the Dreyfus Affair happen. Yes, well, that's the other trouble. The Dreyfus Affair happened when they tried to suggest it went the other way, and it was very quickly found out. Because, again, armed forces tend to leak like sieves when it comes to matters of honour. They really do. And in the case of Billy Mitchell, he's always leaking stuff to the press. Now, let's consider Billy Mitchell's personal experience of war. He starts out his young life when he's, he's gone off to university. He goes and joins Columbia University, which of course is now George Washington University. But he decides he wants to drop out for the Spanish-American War. Yeah, he wants to join that. He drops out of Columbia at 18, enlists in the Army as a private, is mustered into Company M of the 1st Wisconsin Infantry Regiment on the 14th of May, 1898, and he is assigned and mobilized into the brigade of Brigadier General Arthur MacArthur's command in the Philippines. Basically, he goes off to northern Luzon in 1899. Now, thanks to his father's influence, he gains a commission into the U.S. Army Signal Corps. So, notice, he joined as a private in emergency war mobilization, and then Daddy pulls some strings. Daddy pulls some strings. And that's not you know, unfair. Let's be honest. If you're any father, if you've got your son fighting in the Philippines against in the Philippine America sort of American war against Filipino insurgents and all those things, you're going to pull some strings. If you've got any strings to pull as quickly as you can to get your son out of that scenario, any decent father will try to do that. I don't hold that against anyone. Following the end of the war, Mitchell remains in the army. He decides not to go back to university. No, he stays in the army. And from 1900 to 1904, he was posted in the District of Alaska. He's a lieutenant in the Signal Corps, and he's in charge of building, along with Captain George C. Brunel, Brunnell, so rather appropriate name in many ways for this role, with building the Washington-Alaska Military Cable and Telegraph System. Now this, in 1906, earns him a posting to become an instructor at the Army Signal School in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And that's where he starts to tell all the young students, the young trainee signals personnel, that the future of war is not going to be on the ground. It's going to be in the air. There's going to be no ground war. This is in 1906. I'm not going to point out the aircraft that are flying around in 1906, but they're very rudimentary. 1908, he actually, for the first time, sees an aircraft flying. He spots Wright's flying demonstration at Fort Virginia. And at this point, he starts to take lessons at the Curtiss Flying School. Which was a good thing, because if he hadn't taken those lessons, he would have not been able to actually serve as a flying officer, because he was too old. The Army wasn't prepared to train him. In March 1912, he toured battlefields of the Russo-Japanese War, and it's from this scenario that he concludes that war with Japan was inevitable one day, apparently. One of the interesting things about that is I have seen this idea referenced at various points, but I haven't actually found a decent reference that I would actually point to for it. So I'm thinking this is one of the things that comes from burnishing his halo, because again, that's 1912. You're predicting who you're going to be at war with in 30 years' time? I know you claim to be a visionary, but come on. Hello there. I'll pass that on to, just received your message as well. Your WhatsApp there. Sorry. I did say that, should I respond to this WhatsApp message which just popped up right now? No, he's on the screen watching me. Just received it. Yeah, it's an interesting scenario, some of the aircraft at that point. And later that year, he's selected as one of the officers to serve on the General Staff, and was its youngest member at age 32. When did he first tell someone that was inside? December 8th, 1941? No, there are various points at which people claim he told them about it, and, you know, that at different points in history. Knights and everyone, there's a lot of effort you're putting into the word nearly broke out in 1914. At that scenario, it was not breaking out. The Americans were not planning on a war with Japan in 1914, and neither were the Japanese planning on a war with Americans, and there was very little likelihood of it. I know there are incidents which are talked up, but in that period, that's not where the relationship is going. The relationship goes rapidly downhill, but at this point, it's still at the point at which they're talking. Now, there's a difference between being a visionary and outright having a crystal ball that predicts the future. I know, and it's strange how many things he gets wrong for having such a crystal ball. Because, as said, he doesn't believe Pearl Harbor will ever be attacked by carrier-based aircraft because they're not powerful enough. It'll be strategic bombers from the islands in the Pacific. That's what. Not when he said he first told someone, but when he actually did. That gets into a whole different thing. We're not going there, okay? So, the thing that's interesting, though, is that because he's the only single corps officer in the General Staff, and because he's the youngest and the only one who's been doing aviation training, he's chosen for legislative hearings to consider a bill to make an Army aviation branch, separate from the Signal Corps. And so he testifies against the bill. In 1913, he's testifying against the idea of separating the aviation branch from the Signal Corps. Nice to go, everyone. The British do not actively get involved. The bigger problem for the Americans is going to war with Japan. They're going to require quite a lot of merchant ships to carry a lot of their coal in 1914, and the British might have a view on that. The British don't need to actively get involved in the war in 1914 to have an impact, but this is kind of off the topic. I understand why you're bringing it up, but it's not really too relevant. That's what. Does he invent air-to-air refueling? No. It's like he also doesn't invent aerial torpedoes. I mean, that's another thing. Apparently, he's claiming he did. At various points, people say he did. He invented aerial torpedoing. No, he didn't. At no point did he. And then they go, well, no, he improved it. No, he didn't. He really didn't. In fact, his whole obsession is with bombing ships. It could be understandable if he broke the exercise by using a torpedo. But the fact is, the US Navy knew torpedoes could sink ships, and aircraft can carry torpedoes. So everyone knew aircraft could sink ships. And Michael Couch was pointing out, and like I said, I don't want to get into the whole off the side argument with you. I'm just saying no, don't carry on. Gagamba. Basically, the point I think Michael Couch was trying to make, and I read it, is that, again, like the Russo-Japanese War, the British might not join the war, but there are ways to make their neutrality work for them. And that neutrality could extend to, we'd not like British merchant ships supplying X at the other side, or etc. on this. And there was the fact that the Russians found it very difficult to try and get coal along their trips because the British merchant ships weren't supplying them with coal. And British make up the majority of the coal transfers and coal movement, especially in Southeast Asia and a large chunk of the world. So even a neutral Britain can cause a lot of problems. So neutral Britain might not be actively engaged in the war on the side of Japan, but America would still have issues with a neutral Britain, because neutral Britain could be, we're neutral, so therefore we can't supply either side. We can't help either side, because we're neutral in terms of our treaty. At which point America has to do a lot of things to sort itself out. That again, you have to, one of the things you have to remember is there's a lot of firepower for nations below war fighting. So that's the scenario we're talking about. Not Britain actively getting involved in a war for the Japanese. No, that's not going to happen. But the British could go, look, we've got issues coming up in Europe at the moment. We do not want Japan distracted by this, and we don't want America distracted by this. So we're just going to make sure neither side has the coal to actually fight a battle. So you can be at war with each other, but you're not going anywhere to get at each other. You're going to have a strange conflict where occasionally individual ships are going to bump into each other in the middle of the ocean. And for the Americans, they'd better hope that ship they bump into isn't a Congo. Gamma. Then the Russians used the German. The Russians ended up trying to use German and French colliers for the expedition, and they had an interesting time with A, coal quality, and B, those coal merchants actually being able to supply the quantity they were requested. And let's be honest, to send the Russian Pacific fleet versus sending the American fleet, you're talking a quantum difference in the amount of coal you need to use. Because the American fleet is a lot bigger and a lot more coal intensive than the Russians. Now, if we get back to Billy Mitchell, because of his work, and also, again, because he's the only Signal Corps officer in the General Staff, which seems absurd, okay? You have a General Staff, which is supposed to be setting up your country to run your military, your army, and you have only one officer on your staff who is a Signals Corps officer. If I find out, and if I go and look up that staff and its actual composition, if I went and looked at it and found there was only one signals officer, one engineering officer, and a whole load of infantry and cavalry officers and one artilleryman, I would not be surprised, but I'd also be thoroughly annoyed at them. Okay? Signals is kind of important. Especially this time when they also cover your aviation duties. Even in 1913, 1912, you'd expect them to have more than one officer. Marna, so I can only picture Billy Mitchell reading about Harry Yarnell's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1942. It wasn't fair, it wasn't done right, and he cheated. Oh, you have no idea. Anyway. So, he's chosen as temporary head of the aviation section of the US Signal Corps in late 1913. And he's still part of it as his deputy. In May 1916, let me get this right. So, he is the person who basically sets up the Corps because he's the only signals officer in the Corps, in the staff. And then of course they appoint a head for it. But then the head but he's basically formed it, if that makes sense. And then in May 1916, when the person who's appointed to run it is reprimanded and relieved of duty for malfeasance, and please note, basically, that's a failure to discharge public obligations existing by common law, custom, or statute, i.e., for not doing his job. Mitchell is appointed its temporary head again. And then he's eventually replaced, then Lieutenant Colonel George O'Square comes and takes over. And he makes Mitchell his permanent assistant and basically his deputy. So, in June 1916, he takes flying lessons. As literally, he was by age and rank prescribed from aviator training. So he spent the equivalent of, well, probably about $40,000 in today's money. less than $1,500 then, but that's probably about $40,000 today. He spent that to get his pilot's wings, basically. And then in July 1916, he's promoted to a major and is appointed Chief of the Air Service of the Chief of the Air Service of the First Army. Robert Alford, that sounds about right. We were still arguing about trucks or mules being better for supply. Look, you were still arguing about trucks or mules in 1920. Do not go... There were lots of armies still making that argument in 1920. Right. Isn't malfeasance applied as on purpose as opposed to just incompetent? It is. I will be on Discord after this, and I'm sure if any of you do show up, it will be a long discussion of malfeasance and some of the malfeasance involved. But this is the point. There are lots of ways to lose your position in the military. And one of the things I've noticed that comes up more and more these days as a defense is people going, well, you know, I'm not being got rid of because of the thing I've done wrong. I'm being got rid of because of X, Y, or Z, my views, my other, this, that, the other. And yeah, there is probably a bit of that sometimes, but that's the trouble with being a poster child. Sometimes, you know, like Billy Mitchell was and like others are. If you are going to be shouting from the highest parapet your views, and you have to hold yourself to a higher standard, because if anything is wrong with you, if you have done anything wrong, there are going to be people gunning for you. That's the nature of being so publicly visible. That's the fact of life. You might not wish it was so, but yes, people who are more prominent are usually held to a slightly higher standard than people who are less prominent. Or rather, let me put it this way. People who are more prominent, when what they've been doing is found out publicly, are held to a higher standard than people who are less prominent, because people like to make an example of them. If they can hush it up and keep it hushed up, they can get promoted for years and years and years. The trouble is that's always building up an X factor, because the more you hush something up, the worse you make it. The worse you make it, the bigger your fall when it eventually does come out. And let's be honest, the one thing humans love to do is gossip. So, when the USA decided to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917, Mitchell was actually already in Spain en route to France as an observer. He arrives in Paris on the 10th of April, sets up an office for the aviation section, and he then gets to meet Hugh Trenchard, that lovely British leader of air power, and the French air leaders as well, and studies what they're doing, their strategies. And he is most unique in the people who are setting this up, in that he actually likes to try and go flying off himself. He actually makes the first flight by an American officer over German lines, flying with a French pilot on the 24th of April 1917. Think about that. You have got basically the head of the air section of the US Expeditionary Forces. And he's gone off flying over enemy lines. Why? You can say he's getting personal experience himself, but let's be honest. If he got shot down and killed, which is not beyond the realms of possibility in this period, that's going to leave the whole section which is forming up in Europe, the whole air section which is forming up in Europe, which is basically dependent on him forming it up, without leadership. the phrases used are a daring, flamboyant, tireless leader. That's what comes through in many, many works, and I would actually add on more. They get more and more gregarious. They call him a great heroic leader. And this is the thing. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but once you get to a certain rank, and he does get to, in May 1917, you have to remember, he is a lieutenant colonel, and he's given a temporary rank of full colonel in October. He's a very senior officer to be going off doing those sorts of operations. In September 1918, now, this is where you get things really interesting, because there is a discussion of how much he was involved in this, because it's often, it's kind of interesting. He's involved in an operation which has 1,500 British, French, and Italian aircraft in the air phase of the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. Okay? Now, the interesting thing here is that when you start to look at the commanders and leaders and senior officers of this operation, once you start actually looking into it, you find it's a very interesting discussion of exactly how much Billy Mitchell was actually involved in. Most books from Billy Mitchell's side of the Atlantic, side of the pond, will say that he planned and led it. One of the first coordinated air-ground offensives in history. And for this, he's elevated to the temporary rank of Brigadier General, 14th of October 1918, and is in command of all American air units in France. But the thing is, the vast majority of aircraft involved were not American. And there are vastly more senior British and French officers involved than Mitchell. What I think is potentially interesting is, as I understand it from some sources, and others disagree on this, so I'm not going to say whether or not he actually flew in the operations, and therefore he claims he led it. Because he was the most senior officer who flew in the operation. Okay. The first thing you have to realise is that also during this period of World War I, he manages to successfully, despite all these great things he apparently does, and actually probably does do, manages to alienate pretty much every single senior officer and equivalent officer in not just the American armed forces deployed to Europe, but a fairly large chunk of the British and French. But he is very popular in the press. He always has a quote, he's a dashing gentleman. And he's a good-looking dashing gentleman. Let's be honest, let's, see these pictures. This is a dashing, noble-looking warrior. This is a knight of the sky. And he's very good at making his case with the press, which probably doesn't help him with some of his seniors. Let's be honest, that's probably part of it. But there's also the fact that he is very much the ardent view that you know, air power is the future of war, and there's going to be no ground war, no sea war, nothing like that in the future. It's all going to be air warfare. And he's still pushing that idea. Okay, we are, by the way, at roughly a third of the way through these slides. Is there a British version of Billy Mitchell? Not quite the same. Let me put it this way. In terms of air power theorist and purist, you probably have Trenchard followed by Slessor. But in terms of jumping in the aircraft, charging around, no. That's good. Is he good at getting a press on side because he writes most of the story for them? Oh, we won't get there. Oh, good lord. That would be asking. I cannot say whether he writes most of the press for him. So he returns to America in 1919. And he pretty much expected that he would return in 1919 and be assigned Director of the Air Service. Unfortunately, he finds that, actually, Major General Charles T. Minower, an artilleryman, has been assigned by General John Pershing to command the air services. Now, Minower had commanded the Rainbow Division, the 42nd Infantry Division, in France, and had been decorated for it, and was the senior officer. But we can all imagine what happens. Mitchell instead gets appointed as Director of Military Aeronautics, which was the flying component of the air service, would broadly go. I'm not going to get into the whole military aeronautics branch at this point, because otherwise I'd spend far more time on Mitchell than I would on tests. Yeah, Fuller is about time. Well, yes, but also Fuller... This is going to sound strange, but Fuller has some interesting skills to back up his statements. And actually writes some good history books. It's Fuller, isn't it? Yeah. Or is it the other one? I think it's Fuller. Yeah. Fuller. He did write some history books. His Tanks of the Great War is worth a read, by the way. It's about 18... this is just on the subject of Fuller. His Tanks of the Great War, 1914-18, is currently in the... I think the Amazon print-to-order list directly from them. And its paperback's about 18 quid. Its hardcover's about 26. Its Kindle's about 4 quid. And it's worthwhile reading. It is. Now, the problem for Mitchell is that quite a lot of agencies, including the one which had been for naval aeronautics, etc., expired 6 months after the signing of the peace treaty. They were wartime agencies only. And Mariner starts reorganizing the air service based on the divisional system of the American Expeditionary Force, which eliminates the military aeronautics as an organization. And Mitchell's then assigned as first assistant executive in charge of training and operations group, Office of Director of Air Services. This is in April 1919. He was allowed to retain his rank of Brigadier General until June, the 18th June 1920, when he was reduced to Lieutenant Colonel of the Signal Corps. At the same point, Menoa, by the way, the Major General, is reduced to a Brigadier in the same orders, because basically the American Army doesn't like having too many senior officers at this point. And kind of like the US Navy only has Rear Admirals, the US Army doesn't like to have any more senior officers, and they're just temporary appointments above that. Markuch, Pershing, one of the senior officers at Mitchell outside of France appoints someone else to the job. What a surprise. Oh, yeah. Let me put it this way. He'd also upset Menoa. He'd upset pretty much everyone of the rank of Brigadier and above in France other than himself in the US Army. Now, in 4th of June 1920, Congress reorganized itself again, and reorganizes the army as well again. And this time, the air service is recognized as a combatant arm of the line, third in size behind infantry and artillery. So basically, when infantry, artillery, air service, logistics, armor. I think the tanks were below that. Mitchell is given a rank of full colonel in the Signal Corps. But he also receives what's called a recess appointment. Now, again, this is an appointment by president or federal official in the US when they're appointed to appoint someone to a role for whilst they're in that role they have a senior rank. So whilst he's Assistant Chief of the Air Service, he's given the rank of Brigadier General. So he's actually fully a colonel, but he's given, while he's in the post, the rank of Brigadier General. And he's then transferred, and he gets the full rank of colonel in the air service as well, which is nice. So he's no longer part of the Signal Corps, he's part of the air service. And he's also given that the rank in July the 1st and placed him first in seniority amongst all the air service branch officers. So now he's sure he's going to get a top job because he's now the most senior colonel in the air service. Okay? All he has to do, theoretically would have to do, is wait for Menoa to retire, which he would at some point, and then he'd be the boss. And he's got Warren G. Harding and the Senate all behind appointing him as the Assistant Chief of the Air Service and giving him the recess appointment to Brigadier General. So he's good. Sadly enough, Mitchell is a bit of an odd duck, really, in some regards. And this is another point where I can get behind him. I can agree with him. He doesn't believe World War I was the war to end all wars. He doesn't think it's going to happen. He had a fervent belief that would be a major war within 10 years. And that an independent air force was needed to be equal to the Army and Navy. And he keeps pushing these things. He keeps pushing legislation. He keeps trying to make recommendations and send fact-finding missions to Europe. And all sorts of things. He's trying to push forward things of, we've got to have air power as a separate service equal to the Army and Navy, and air power is the future of war. Everything is going to be air power. That's Squad, Pershing, yes, you're the most senior colonel, but I'm assigning this private to the head of the because I despise you. Don't tempt Pershing. Don't tempt him. He would do it. He would. I thought tanks came under artillery until mid-30s. You are quite correct. Tanks did come under artillery till mid-30s. But the thing was, they were also recognised as coming under artillery, so that it just gets weird, okay? You know, I added them in because I felt like mentioning them. The point was, they are under artillery, but they're also sort of a subsection in that. It's... Okay, let's put it this way. It's designing your army by political compromise. It's just weird, okay? That could be an entire video in and of itself. Of how not to do it. So, with all this going on, and all this fighting, he managed to do something else unique, okay? So, here's the thing. This guy is Admiral William Benson, who fervently believed that that there was not, and his actual quote is, he could not conceive any use of the fleet will ever have for aviation. This man is as anti-air power as you can get. This is Roosevelt, who actually reverses that sort of advocate of Benson and actually managed to make sure that a aeronautics organization, Bureau of Aeronautics, is created after those wartime agencies are gone, and appoints Moffett to run it. Moffett, who I've already talked about on this channel a couple times, is one of the biggest air power proponents you will ever get. He's really pushing air power. He does all the backroom deals. He does more to secure the Bureau of Aeronautics and Naval Aviation than pretty much anyone else. And Sims here. A man who's literally using wargaming to redevelop the future of the US Navy. By the way, spends also quite a lot of his time arguing with all these ones. And these two spend quite a lot of time arguing with this one. And they even argue with each other. Do you know what unites all four of them? All four are united by one thing. They hate Billy Mitchell. Because he keeps interfering in the Navy and causing trouble. He keeps causing problems. And he causes problems because he just goes around saying things like battleships should be got rid of and air power should be won and there's no point for aircraft carriers and all those things. And the US Navy are going, you're not helping us. But he's right in his mind. He is very sure the future, there is going to be wars in the future. Unlike so many people who are hoping there won't be wars again in the future. And the future of wars are going to be air power and everything's going to be air power. But yes, he managed to achieve something which no one else could probably achieve. The unifying of these four personalities. The one time they actually ever agree is... Billy Mitchell said, well, yeah, we're all marshalling. It's kind of like, if you can... It's not the four horsemen of the apocalypse. It's like you have four different versions of, I don't know, Genghis Khan. Who all hate each other. Completely. But they will unify in one. For this one person who keeps causing them trouble. It's an amazing skill. You know, when he's actually, because of issues... he's actually, you know, meeting with Roosevelt, with the Board of Admirals on the April the 3rd, 1919. He says the surface fleet is obsolescent, submarines are pointless, and that naval aviation is the only future for warfare. He said that the air service could develop whatever bomb was needed to sink any ship, and that you want a unified organization that would bring together land, sea, and air components in one. Roosevelt, the guy who proposes, supports, and basically is the political person who managed to get through aviation in the US Navy, describes him publicly using the word pernicious. And it's quite funny because he turns around to them and goes, he's making things which are blatantly not true. For example, whilst the US Navy was not exactly the fastest to get in this race, they were already involved in developing aerial torpedoes because they'd seen the British using them in World War One, and they knew the Japanese had been using World War One, so they were already developing them. And then he claims he's the person who pushed them to develop them, and it's a case of, no, you're not. Michael, hang on. Aviation future. Yes, that's because Michael Cooch, he believes in the heavy bomber. Please note the use of the phrase bombs. He will say whatever bomb was needed to sink a battleship or any ship ever created, he would create. It would be bombs that would sink them. Now, he actually managed to cause fighting between not just him and the Navy, but between the Army and the Navy. He's actually single-handedly responsible for for a lot of the degrees of coolness and bad tension and disagreements between the US Army and Navy. And honestly, it's the legacy of Mitchell, which is one of the key things which leads up to the Admiral's Revolt post-World War II, when the idea of making the US Naval Aviation part of the US Air Force is basically defeated by the US Admirals en masse threatening to resign and cause trouble. Anti-aircraft guns didn't matter to someone like Mitchell. He believed that within 10 years, and this is one of the statements he makes up to various points, the strategic air bombardment will become a threat to the United States, and the air service will become the first line of defense instead of a navy, so you should cut funding for Navy's capital ship program to invest in the air service. Within 10 years of 1919. So he's talking by 1929. I'm just sitting there going, strategic bombing threat. The only strategic bombing threat that could have been to the Americans in 10 years would be if the British had moved heavy bomber squadrons from their bases in Europe to Canada. That's the only way heavy bombers could reach frigating America. At that point. Oh, he's not sure if he's going to be fighting Japan, Britain. He has all sorts of options for who they're going to be fighting in 1929. He's sure they're going to be at war with someone within 10 years. Some would say he's a bit of a warhound, you know. And so he starts putting forward arguments that ships can be sunk by air power. And ships will be sunk by air power. And to try and make his case as strong as possible, he had his aircraft, any aircraft he could within the service under his command, doing whatever he could to raise their profile. So he'd send aircraft off to fight forest fires, conduct border patrols. He tried to use air power to, and this is later than we're talking about, I think he used air power against miners, and to try and break up, there was a big mining dispute, and yeah, he basically volunteered to bomb Americans. As a method of, I don't know, dispersal. The fact is that actually, while he was technically supposed to be there, the private company involved was actually hiring people to bomb Americans on American soil. Yeah, we'll leave to one side. My coach, British moving heavy bombs again. British Army Navy. Well, if it means we can ship Trenchard out there, we'll support it. Oh God, they would have done. Oh. Yeah, if they could have got Trenchard to go with them, they would have... Seriously, the Royal Navy would have paid the transport fees. They'd have loaded up every merchant ship they could have got, and with all the aircraft and all the person they could, and paid for the one-way trip. He also was in, Mitchell was also keen on aviation records. Anything that would keep aviation news. Anything which would protect the capability of it for the future. And the trouble with all this atmosphere, of all this political pressure is, well, it leads to the Project B. So, here is the fun. We have two gentlemen here, and they're two politicians. We have the Secretary of War, Newton Baker. I think it's that's Newton Baker. And we have Secretary of Navy Joseph Daniels. And well, the trouble is with Mitchell keep making these statements in the press and go, it's causing trouble. So they decide they want to have Project B, which was going to be a series of joint Army-Navy exercises. And by the way, in the long history of Army-Navy exercises, frankly, in the 1920s and 30s, they aren't good. They rarely end in less than acrimony, because... how do I put this politely? Both sides like to win, and both sides like to try to write the rules to best suit them. And usually they meet a happy middle ground. I'd say with Project B they actually get to quite a fair, even point, but I would be considered. This is a naval history channel. I'm a naval historian. I'm probably going to be accused of being biased towards the naval side. Hey, look, before anyone starts talking about the British bombers in Canada, etc. at this point, just wait till we get to the next, I think, is it the next slide or the slide after that? It's 2 slides time, then you're going to be really, really enraptured. So, Mitchell felt that building of dreadnoughts was taking money away from aviation. And he felt anti-ship aircraft could defend a coastline far better than coastal guns and naval vessels. Now, this is even the point at which that you don't just have a fleet to defend your coastline. We'll leave that to one side. You have to actually project power slightly further than the coastline, because otherwise, if you're something like the Royal Navy, you just sit beyond the range of aircraft and start taking out the trade and go, hello, you can't reach me. How cute. We'll leave that to one side, and this gets really funny as this goes on. And at one point, he actually claims that 1,000 bombers could be built for the same cost as one battleship and could sink that battleship. Now, whilst I agree, 1,000 bombers versus a single aircraft, 1,000 bomber aircraft versus a single ship, I would hope they'd sink it. I'd like to point out that there is no way in Hootenanny you can buy 1,000 bombers, load them with ammunition, fuel them, train all the pilots and the aircrew over the years it takes so they can do their job properly, and then fire them at a single battle for the cost of one battleship. If there's anyone who believes that, please do the maths in the chat. I would love to watch it. But if we consider the costs of the US Navy ships, let's see. There's usually a decent price figure. The US are fairly good in their scenarios of giving prices for their ships, and we're talking about 1920s. So let's go down to the most expensive there will be. Okay. Let's go to the Colorados. Okay, let's Google it. How much did USS Colorado cost? There are some really weird figures around this ship because I am absolutely certain it wasn't that. Let's check the Tennessee. Why is it the US Navy tends to have fundings for costs for almost every single ship on their details of the ships, and then the one time I actually look up their battleships, I actually want the cost, they don't have it. But no, there are figures around as it cost $100 million to build a battleship. Not in that period. It didn't. Nevada had 1,500 crew, 1,000 level bombers. That's 4 to 8 crew. That's the legislative budget. Yeah, it's just absurd. Bay 17 cost 20,000. 1 hour cost 100 million. So yes, but that we're talking about in 1940s. Okay, there's been a lot of inflation between then and 1920s. I agree that 100 million could be the figure for an Iowa class. But inflation, how much did a 1920s battleship cost? And that's what I was trying to look up. I should not have this thought at this point. I should have had this thought earlier when I was doing the design, when I was putting this together earlier, and have looked it up then. I really should. I do apologize, but I didn't have that thought then when I was going through those things for some reason. Let me just, USS Nevada, about 6 million. Oh, thank you, Gagamba. Thank you. USS Nevada was about 6 million in 1911. So, probably we're looking at, let's say, post-World War, we're talking 1920, let's say it's about 10 million. Let's be nice. About $10 million. I don't think that's going to work out. Anyway, with these arguments he's making, he's putting forward all this stuff, all these points, and so they decide they're going to actually have an exercise to test it out. And the Navy agrees to the demonstration only after news leaks of them actually conducting their own tests. The Navy had sunk the USS Indiana using its own aircraft on November the 1st, 1920. Which is kind of a strange thing. The US Navy is doing its own tests of air power, but Billy Mitchell is claiming they have no understanding of the value of air power. Indiana, of course, was a pre-dreadnought vessel, which had been first laid down in 1891 and launched in 1893. So, her being... well, how to put it? Her being sunk as a target on the 1st November 1920, when she is 27 years old, and let's be honest, not just... did she have Harvey armor? I think she might have just about got Harvey armor, but yeah, she's not exactly great. She's not exactly great. But their testings were pretty thorough. They were doing a whole testing system to try and work out what was the damage and what they could work through. Now, Joseph Daniels had hoped to shut up Mitchell, pretty much it seems, by releasing a report which had been written by the then Captain Leahy. Remember when I talked earlier about a fleet admiral who actually outranked MacArthur? Well, that's William D. Leahy. This is the same guy. The guy who's basically Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief from 1942 to March 21st, 1949. He's under both Roosevelt and Truman. And it would basically sets up the role that eventually becomes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So that guy is the guy who studied the exercise and wrote the report. And the report stated, the entire experiment pointed to the improbability of a modern battleship being either destroyed or completely put out of action by aerial bombs at current times. And it's full of interesting things like that. Now, I have to admit, I managed to have a look at that. Thanks to going to the New York Times. And I had to pay some money. So they made me feel grubby. To the New York Times. When I'm looking at articles which are very, very old, and when I say old, I'm talking about something which is from 1921, and you as a newspaper are charging me £2 a month for that access. Admittedly, it's only £2. I'm not too keen on you. If it had been on the Wayback Machine, I would have used it. But it wasn't. And I realise they have to make money. But if they're charging for their back catalogue from the 1920s, one wonders how good their economic point is. Let's be honest, the Times makes me feel the same way when I have to go through their old things. Something you'd find... Believe it or not, the New York Times is not in my local library, sadly enough. But I tracked it down. And actually, here was what the thing was, and I'm going to say this again. Their own website, when I was trying to find the article, because I had a note about the article in the book, couldn't find it. So I ended up going to the Wikipedia page, finding the link on the Wikipedia page, following that link, and that took me to it. Don't ask me what was going on with their website that day. It's a fun time. Honestly, a lot of fun. Anyway. But the thing is, the Navy had done the tests using sand bombs. And had used high explosives placed on the ship to sink it. Etc. All sorts of things to test. Because they were trying to test the accuracy and work out where it would go and simulate it. So Congress backed the Navy into a corner, thanks to Billy Mitchell's urgings. And, well, as you can see here, they have to set up it up. Um, one interesting thing was that Billy Mitchell then starts another fight over it because they agree there's going to be a news blackout until all the data have been analysed. But Mitchell believes the Navy's going to bury the results. So it ends up with the Chief of the Air Corps trying to, that's Meehan, trying to have Mitchell dismissed a week before the tests begin. Basically, he's trying to deal with the Navy's complaints about Mitchell's criticisms. But John Weeks, who's the new Secretary of War, there's a new one. Basically, it starts off with Secretary of War Newton Baker agreeing this, and then Weeks actually implementing it. Was basically forced to back down because of Mitchell's popularity with the public and media support. Oh, that's great. So we're selecting our officers over their popularity to the public now. Hello, Verdun. Well, libraries are free in the UK. It's just they don't tend to have a lot of microfilm in most of them these days, and they don't have things like the New York Times in the UK libraries. Sadly enough. So, let's go see what's agreed. So these are the rules of engagement agreed. Apart from the media blackout, these are the rules of engagement. Ships had to be sunk at least 100 fathoms of water so as not to become navigational hazards. Okay? That makes sense. I think we can all agree with that. The area selected was 50 miles, 80 kilometers off the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, so it was far away from where it would cause trouble. Maximus, cough, BT, cough, popularity, cough, yeah, you know. Political popularity, but yes. Because the US and the British haven't got into the point of fellow officers fragging fellow officers quite yet at this point. The planes were not allowed to use aerial torpedoes. People look at us going, why? The Navy goes, well, it's obvious. We know that torpedoes can sink ships. If they use aerial torpedoes, the ships aren't manoeuvring, they're going to sink them. They've got no damage control. The planes were not allowed to. They only allowed to use their heaviest bombs twice on the battleships, and smaller ships could not be attacked with weapons larger than 600 pounds. And the reason for this was between hits, time was to be allowed for a damage control party to board and assess. This whole point of this thing was so that the US Navy could assess the damage that could be inflicted by air power on ships. That's what they wanted. They want to understand it. But the trouble is, to an extent, the US Army Air Service, the Air Corps, is going with the idea that this is proving they want to prove they can sink ships. The really sad thing here is Billy Mitchell is a bit late in this scenario, because he wants to prove he can sink ships, but it's been done. They can do that with torpedoes. That's why there's torpedo bombers being developed by everyone, including the US Navy at this point. It's why the Royal Navy has the SOP with the Royal Air Force, Royal Navy has the SOP with Cuckoo in service and all sorts of things. So, you know, that's already in existence. That's proven that aircraft can sink ships with torpedoes. But what he wants to do is sink them with bombs. Okay? He wants to sink them with bombs. Naval interpretation, this allowed for maximum chance for inspection and learning, simulated a real experience, because it's far enough away. Air service interpretation. This was too much in favour of the survivability of the ships, because they're not going to be hit by repeated target quickly enough. And by not selecting either the two areas closer to the base, they were putting an unfair disadvantage on the aircraft in terms of their ability to operate over the target area. This is a really strange one for me. So basically, if you're looking at this, you either have to have... Because, again, remember, Mitchell's been put in a case of 1,000 bombers. So if your bombers, what you're saying is, the enemy has to come within range of your bombers, and you're going to require a thousand bombers at multiple state places. Because if you've got you've got 5 battleships, you can move them up and down your coast and cover anywhere. But if you've got to set up the air bases and infrastructure to support your 1,000 bombers, and probably have got to have a couple of them, because where are they going to cover? If they're launching from one field and the enemy attacks somewhere else, they're not going to be there. So the whole argument gets into a really weird discussion. Now, Carl, you raised a really interesting point there. Should the ships have been sitting on a sandbank during the test? That could have been an interesting idea, but the thing was, they weren't allowed to become navigational hazards. So that's why they are stuck in 100 fathoms of water. Now, it's getting already very acrimonious before the test began, and it truly is acrimonious. And I would add that Mitchell plans to observe and did observe the attacks from his DH-4 aircraft, which is, of course, is a Airco DH-4, designed by Geoffrey de Havilland, and it's a British aircraft. So that might make you all feel a bit going, hang on, what's going on here? So we're going to get into this. It gets more interesting once you consider the forces involved. Because the primary, I would call, heavy force that comes in are the 2nd Bombardment Group, made up of the 49th and 96th Squadron. And they are armed with Martin MBS 1s, Handley Page 0400s, and Caprioni CA5s. Now, I could be very easygoing and just say, do you want to Google those? Do you want to? Because if you're thinking, Alex, hang on, one of those is American, one of those is British, and one of those is Italian, you'd be right. The wrecks have been dived on those that are still there. Well, wooden mock-ups wouldn't give you the real thing, would it? And that's the thing. The ships weren't going to have crew aboard. They weren't going to have anything on them. Now, honestly, there are going to be bombs bigger than that. Because again, if we go back to this point, bombs larger than 600 pounds could only be used on the large ships. Smaller ships cannot be attacked with bombs larger than 600. Where's the Vimian? Where's the Vimy in the photo? There isn't a Vimy as part of their force. Peter Dawson. Their force is literally Martin MBS, Handley Page 0400, and Caprioni CA5 bombers. They're also... The fact is that quite a lot of their aircraft are Royal Aircraft Factory SE5 fighters. Quite literally, if you're looking at Air Service Field Squadron, they operate SE5s. They have SE5s. They have de Havillands. Pretty much there's quite a lot of British aircraft here. Now, there's a debate on the 2,000-pound bombs, and you're getting into that one. I see already, a Night 681. But the fact is, they do seem to be allowed. But the thing was, the phrase that was limited is, only use their heaviest bombs twice. Only allowed to use their heaviest bombs twice. So they're only allowed to drop them twice on the battleship. Now, these aircraft, some of them, these aircraft are the biggest aircraft involved. And they can carry heavy bombs. This could carry, the MBS-1 could carry a 2,000 bomb external load. The Handley Page, I think, could also do quite a decent bomb load external. Yeah, up to 2,000 pounds of bombs. And the CA3... depends on the exact variant you've got. But... oh, that's a it's a CA5, isn't it? And that's a... I think that picture is the CA3, but it's a CA5 in the actual service. But the CA5's picture is, I'm not really sure about it. And that could carry about 1,100 pounds worth of bombs. About. Probably could go a bit higher. No, so is that 2,000 pounds of bombs or single? I think both of these could do a single 2,000 pound bomb, and I don't think this could. No, these were the latest, greatest bombers available, Peter Dawson. That's the thing. We're talking 1920. And yes, there is a Vimy in the world. But the Vickers Vimy, if you are thinking about that, is introduced into service in 1919 and only ever serves with the Royal Air Force. And if I'm not mistaken, well, that could only carry could carry 2,004, nearly 2,500 pounds worth of bombs. But yeah, that was only ever operated by the UK. I think civilian versions were used by China, France, and Spain, and possibly the Soviet Union. But yeah, that was only ever used by the UK. So these are the latest, greatest bombers the US can get. I feel the good doctor is about to order us off his land. Here, you! Off my land! There were no night attack tests. They weren't flying at night. So this is part of the Navy's problem with the whole argument for aircraft, because they're not doing night operations, they're not doing operations stormy weather, they're not doing all these things. It has to be good weather. It has to be good weather from the Royal Navy, from the US Navy's perspective. They want good weather because of that would allow them to be aboard for inspection learning. But also from the Air Service, they want good weather because they need it to in order to be able to fly. And the targets? Well, the targets are pretty darn interesting again. They are things like, well, the Ostfriesland, as you note, sitting here. But there are also other ships there. There's the Frankfurt. That's that light cruiser. And there's some German destroyers. And all these vessels are out to be hit. But the thing is, none of them are exactly brand new. None of them are exactly the latest full flush of things, are they? The Ostfriesland had been laid down in 1908, launched in 1909, commissioned in 1911. She is a dreadnought, but let's be honest, she's a dreadnought which, how do I put this, has only 2.5 inches of KCA armor on her, and it's crump cemented armor, yes, but only 2.5 inches of KCA on her actual deck. And yeah, she has a belt of 11.8 inches, but it's the deck arm which is going to matter when you're being hit. Frankfurt's not much better. They're offering no resistance. The ships are not going to be maneuvering. They're not going to be crewed, so there's going to be no damage control. There's no maneuvering, no damage control. And in reality, there's also... they're only going aboard to observe and see what the damage is. So basically, their whole purpose for this fight, as for the US Navy, is to watch the damage. So, the fact is, he manages to keep it within the limits, okay? This is the point. Mitchell holds the restrictions on the 21st of June, on the 13th of July, and the 18th of July. He sinks a German destroyer, the Frankfurt. In every single one of these attacks, the ships are first attacked by SE-5 fighters, strafing and bombing the decks. And also using 25-pounder anti-personnel bombs. This is to simulate the suppression of anti-aircraft fire. And they are followed up with attacks using mainly Martin NBS-1s, dropping their high-explosive demolition bombs, and Mitchell observing these attacks from the control of his de Havilland fort. Are the watertight doors closed? Yes, but remember, if there's any small leaks, there's no one there to shore them up and fix them. They even have those sort of signs stuck up on the mast switches. When they're raised, the people are aboard. When they're not raised, the observers, the people watching it, are not aboard, so to try and stop them being hit. And you will notice there is some things painted on them, which does make it easier to work out which is a warship you're supposed to be attacking. On the 20th of July, therefore, the USN brings out the Ostfriesland. The scheduled day, there was supposed to be 230-pound, 550-pound, and 600-pound attack. That's 100, 250, and 270 kilogram bomb attacks by US Navy, US Marine Corps, and US Army aircraft. And at that point, after those attacks, she settled 3 feet by the stern with a 5-degree list to port. She was taking on water already. The USN said, delayed the further bombing by a day because rough seas had prevented the board observers from going aboard. The fact is, the air service claims that as their bombers were approaching, they were ordered not to attack and forced to circle for 47 minutes. So they only dropped half their bombs and none of their large bombs. There were issues, in other words. On the 21st of July, well, 5 Martin MBS bombers, led by First Lieutenant Clayton Bissell, each dropped a single 1,100-pound, that's 500 kilogram bomb each, and scored 3 hits with those. The Navy stopped further drops because they wanted to assess damage. By noon, Ostfriesland settled 2 more feet by the stern and 1 foot by the bow. it's at this point. So Navy there are 9 bombs remaining from the first morning strike, because the US Navy wants to get on there. So far, the US Navy are playing a fairly honest game. Yes, it's frustrating to the Army Air Service because they want to get in and bomb the ship and show what they can do, but the Navy wants to see the damage. In the afternoon, Captain Walter R. Lawson's flight of bombers, which consisted of 2 Hadley Page 0400s and 6 Martin MBS-1 bombers, loaded with 2,000-pound bombs, were dispatched. One of the Hadley Page dropped out for mechanical reasons, but in direct violation of the rules, which were 2 bombs, 2 2,000-pound bombs only, the MBS-1s dropped 6 bombs in quick succession between 12:18 p.m. and 12:31 p.m. They were aiming for the water near the ship, and Mitchell describes it as, and this is one of his more interesting quotes, because this goes into his book, The Winged Defense, which I did have out. I might have packed it in a box already. But I did have it out. I was reading it earlier, but it's in my notes. Anyway. Because basically I'm using my notes from the testing which I made years ago for my PhD. Which is of course fun, because some of the reference points I had no longer exist, as in links to websites, so I hence going off finding or doing this with New York Times. This one was fairly easy to check out. 4 bombs hit in rapid succession, close alongside off Shetland. We could see her rise 8 to 10 feet between the terrific blows from underwater. On the 4th shot, Captain Street, sitting in the backseat of my plane, stood up and waving both arms shouted, "She is gone!" Now, this is a 2,000-pound near miss. And I think this picture is also of that. That picture at the top was her after some of the damage she'd had. So they were left in a leaking condition over a period of time. Pretty much, Dave Brennan. Pretty much. There were no direct hits, officially. But at least 3 of the 6 bombs dropped landed close enough to rip hull plates. And so once you rip hull plates off a ship, it does tend to cause a massive ingress of water, which does tend to cause the ship to roll over. The ship sank at 12:40 p.m. 22 minutes after the first bomb. The 7th bomb from the Hadley Page was dropped on the foam rising up from the sinking ship. Now, here is when you get into some problems. Because Mitchell claims that the sinking was done under wartime conditions. Remember, this is the same man who'd been claiming earlier on that this whole thing was too favourable to the US Navy. It's too favourable to the US Navy. No. It's not realistic at all. And then, it's saying it's sunk under wartime conditions. So, which one is it? They were high explosive. They were massive high explosive bombs. But it is, of course, also violating the rules agreed upon by General Pershing that would allow Navy engineers to examine the effects of the small munitions. And when they eventually recovered the wreck of the Osprey, she showed she had little topside damage from the bombs and was sunk by what was described as a progressive flooding. Unsurprising. That they felt could have been stemmed, but without being able to do ongoing assessments they couldn't know, by damage control aboard the vessel. It ends up with him in a public fight with Mitchell versus Pershing, again, who's in charge of the army, because Mitchell starts citing the sinking as showing battleships will be sunk by aircraft, guaranteed, every single time. And Pershing's going, no, they won't. They violated the rules. It isn't right, and he's trying to smooth over Army-Navy relations because they are currently getting toxic as anything. They run useful damage control data. Well, honestly, the USN actually did. One of the interesting things that comes from it is that this and other testing which goes on afterwards, which, when it does follow the rules, does provide the US Navy with some useful damage control data, which goes into some of the damage control practices when they actually implement them properly. It's one of the really interesting things. If you look at some of the subdivision design, especially on the US battleships, the later one, and the ones which are built in around to World War II, etc., a lot of this stuff is pretty darn good. And it works into it. Now, I would say the argument that's used by a lot of people that it's this case which causes the Navy to put more money towards naval aviation kind of ignores the work of Moffat. And I have to say I find this the big trouble, is that a lot of then what Moffat achieves is said, oh, it's because of Mitchell. And I don't think so. A lot of what is achieved by Moffat in naval aviation is ascribed to Mitchell's actions on this occasion. It's Mitchell which convinces them. Mitchell by having arguments. Mitchell's which portraying this as humiliating for the Navy. Mitchell, as keep going on, he can easily sink battleships, even when in this test, is the one which is, is portrayed as having forced the US Navy to change its views on naval aviation, when realistically these guys were already pushing for that in terms of Roosevelt and Sims, and already wargaming, and I've talked about the development of war games and development of US naval aviation earlier, and Moffat will build up the US Naval Air Service. I think his claim that he goes further than that, because based on data, he claims that seacraft of all kinds, up to and including the most modern battleships, and this is the most famous claim that comes from it, can be destroyed easily by bombs dropped from aircraft, and further, that the most effective means of destruction are bombs. Let's think about this again in 1920. The most effective means of destroying a ship are bombs dropped by aircraft, as long as they're not parked too far away from the coast. Not torpedoes, bombs. And again, the thing is, this ship was not maneuvering, no air defense, no fighters, nothing involved, it's already been damaged, no damage control going on, nothing the crew's doing, no maneuvering. I know why the press is taking this. There's some brilliant pictures, and it's a brilliant discussion point, and I don't expect the press to be informed. But yeah. He then goes on to sink other ships. And this is what's often forgotten. It's not this event which caused him trouble. He takes part in other operations and other testings, and the US Navy basically goes, if you break the rules again, we will no longer play with you. That's it. They even use tear gas attacks on Virginia and New Jersey. I haven't got a picture of New Jersey being hit, but there's a picture of Alabama here, and there's Virginia at the top. Again, they are taking out pre-dreads. Now, the thing is, it also caused huge trouble for other scenarios, which Mitchell didn't seem to realise. You see, the problem for him was the bombing test came just as Harding had announced every invitations for a Washington conference for Washington for a conference on limitation of naval armaments. That was brilliant, because now if battleships were obsolescent, why was anyone proposing their disarmament? They didn't matter anymore, so who cares if Britain has a lot of battleships? We don't need them. We don't need to worry about the British fleet. Tear gas. Yes, tear gas. Don't. White phosphorus looks cool, but yes, there's that. I think that is white phosphorus over the Alabama. Yeah, that's white phosphorus. It wasn't his newest New Jersey, it was the older one. Apologies. And the fact is, it just caused absolute pandemonium. Especially as his report about the attacks were leaked to the press. So despite the fact being told, don't leak them to the press, don't leak the reports, keep these reports internal, but it causes trouble. Because, let's say he'd been successful in making his political point. At the Washington Treaty, then, what would the Royal Navy, the British and British have done? The argument point. Why are we doing a conference on a limitation on battleships when they don't matter anymore? Surely no one will be building battleships anymore. And aircraft carriers don't matter anymore. So there's no point having a naval treaty, is there? Because you don't have a treaty to limit obsolescent weapons. You just laugh at them. We don't need battleships. Aircraft are more mobile. Well, until the logistics of getting the bombs, men, fuel, lectured, and taking the cannon. No one ever thought thinks about logistics. Now, it gets worse. Because he gets into an absolute standing fight with his boss, Menoa. And, well, Menoa is forced to resign and return to the ground forces for personal reasons. Mitchell's resignation is refused. However, Please note, once again, Pershing is expected to promote Mitchell to be in charge of the air service. He doesn't. He sends sends Major General Mason Patrick to sort out the mess. Patrick explained to Mitchell that although he'd accept Mitchell's counsel, all decisions were to be made by him, and there was no more freelancing. Mitchell, though, doesn't understand this, and manages to get into what we will describe as a protocol rift with Moffat. Basically, he tries to claim that he should be the air power consultant and discusser, not Moffat at the Naval Arms Limitation Treaty. Moffat, of course, is the head of the Bureau of Naval Aeronautics. The Bureau of Aeronautics. The Navy's Bureau of Air Power. And not only that, Mitchell is there advocating that they shouldn't worry about aircraft carriers because there's no value in them. So, what Patrick does after this is he goes, well, can I fire him? No. So he sends him on an inspection tour of Europe. That lasts the entire duration of the naval conference. They basically go, we can't fire you, so we're sending you all expenses paid holiday to Europe. Go away. Pershing. Honestly, I think Pershing would have appointed anyone before he appointed Mitchell to command the air section. I'm not sure. I don't say he's reaching, but let's look at Mason Patrick. His history. His army service. He'd been Chief Engineer of the Lines of Communication and Director of Construction and Forestry. He was an engineer by history and experience. And he did actually learn to fly. He learned to fly in 1922 at the age of 59 years old. And he'd basically done all sorts of duties. He had been in charge of air service duties prior to that during World War One. And yeah, he is, when he's put back in charge, he has an interesting time. How'd I put this politely? Patrick ends up dealing with the fallout of Mitchell's fall, and that is a minor storm in itself. Bamos, so in the no Washington Naval Treaty video, will Billy Mitchell sharp as the reason it fails? No, I'm just not doing, just not adding that in. Why would I add in Billy Mitchell, frankly? That would just annoy me. Nice one. Mitchell is ignoring the Argus, Eagle, Hermes, Furious Lang. Mitchell is ignoring a lot of things. Oh. So, what is the other issues of this one? Well, there's quite a lot. And it actually does leave a bit of a legacy, because whilst the legacy of Mitchell is a lot of division with the Navy and eventually his fall of grace over Hawaii and all sorts of things, in this scenario, the legacy of this was the fact that the US Navy and US Army aviation stopped trusting each other. That's the biggest issue. You see, if they stop cooperating and stop believing in joint cooperation and honest working together with each other because they don't trust each other, then you don't get the information exchange you need. You don't get the exercises you need. For example, if we consider US Navy's fleet problems, the Army should have been part of them. Those fleet problems should have been joint problems from the beginning, with US Army aviation and US Army personnel as part of them, especially when they're talking amphibious operations. They should have been fully integrated in them. And the same with the US Army's exercises for logistics and resupply. Those should have, the Navy should, but the thing is, Mitchell sours all that. You know, when I was first set this video, I'm fairly sure that those voting for it and setting would think I was going to talk just about purely about, and I can't speak for StephenMeier, of course, but my suspicion is they thought I was going to purely talk about the effects on ship design. And those were big. Because the US Navy was using the lessons of bombing these ships to try and develop better subdivision. To work out how to design a ship to better resist bombs. And you do that by working out which bits go first. In what order bits go. With bomb hits. So you've got 1 bomb hit, what's happened? You've got 2 bomb hits, what's happened? 3 bomb hits, what's happened? 4 bomb hits, what's happened? 5 bomb hits, oh, what's happened? That's how you do it. You know, you are studying it. You're literally studying the destruction of a ship. So you can better prevent the destruction of ships. Oh, but realistically, the biggest legacy of these is the distrust it causes between the services. And yes, the US Marines are the US Navy's army, so they use them instead for all those scenarios. But if the army had been part of it, it'd been a far better, far more integrated exercise. Leslie Mitchell. I wish you would add Billy every time you say Mitchell. Leslie, we know it's not you. And truly, that's the problem with it. Okay, here's the thing. It's alright to have a vision, and if your vision comes true, that's great. If it's a positive one for the world, or even a useful one for the world, and even if it doesn't come fully great, you know, if you've supported and promoted something which does help, then that's great. But it matters also the methodology. Because the thing about Mitchell is he's very good, Billy Mitchell is very good at building a small coterie of juniors who support him, but he's not very good at leading up. He doesn't know how to manage with professional peers who might ask questions. And I think one of the problems is he was always the youngest person in the room. And I experienced this myself for many years. I was the youngest academic in the room, and I made some enemies that way, I really did. Because I often didn't see what lines I was crossing. And I acknowledge that. But it was also useful. It's a learning experience. But now when I look at other young people when they've achieved quite senior positions, I do sit there and go, you're both important because you don't know what you don't know, and you're prepared to push anyway. Which is good. But there is sometimes there is a sensibility in stopping to ask the question why. And I don't think Billy Mitchell ever considers the point of asking people why they disagree with him. To him, it's obvious that he can hit ships with bombs. Well, no one's arguing that a stationary ship you can hit with a bomb, yes. But it's a maneuvering ship that's defending itself. Can you hit that with enough bombs to sink it? Enough heavy bombs to sink it. And again, we think about this, what most people don't realise is the reason the Royal Navy's focusing on 500-pound bombs when they're designing the Illustrious class and most of the armoured carriers is that they're looking at it and going, well, 1,000-pound bombs are coming into existence, but for most aircraft, for the ranges you're going to need in naval warfare, it's going to be 500-pound bombs we're going to be dealing with dive bombers. And honestly, level bombers dropping their bombs can drop them all day. We can avoid them. And if we've got fighters up, they're going to get wrecked. That is the problem. Mitchell thought it was only an Army Air Force issue. He thought it was only an air power issue. And actually, it was a whole service, whole force issue. So, I didn't think about the doctrine. Well, that's the thing. This has impacts the whole way through. And thank you, Stephen, for being here. I hope you've enjoyed the video. And I hope you enjoyed the long patrol which will come up from this. This information all feeds into doctrine. It all feeds into the experiences. And realistically there, Mitchell, and this is why I find him problematic, because of his actions, because of the way he pushed them, he wasn't necessarily wrong in his ideas, but because of the way he went around doing it, I can see why, though I myself, because of other opportunities, wouldn't make quite the same argument, he actually cost lives in World War II. You could say a lot of the distrust which goes on between the US Army and the US Navy, which stops their different services integrating and properly working well together in terms of integrating on an operation level, not becoming a uni-service level, but integrating operation level, in the 20s and 30s in the run-up to World War II, and often pursuing things at cross purposes. Not quite as bad as the IJA and IJN, but honestly often as bad as the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force and the British Army. And sometimes worse, is because of the legacy of Mitchell and the division he sowed. That is always the problem, Marcus. The really sad thing is that we're back in the same place over air power in 1950. The Air Force can handle everything. Men like Mitchell prevent honest evaluation expectations. The thing is, what you're dealing with is not men like Mitchell, it's... We've all met them in our lives. People who are activists and are purists. We see them in politics, we see them in every walk of life. The people who are literally, you are either 100% this or you are nothing. You are for air power over everything, or you are nothing. You're not true. You have to be a true believer. And the reality, as I stressed at the beginning, is the history of warfare is the history of combined arms being successfully brought together. And the thing is, doesn't matter if you're a true believer in air power, sea power, land power, whatever system, whether you believe drones are going to conquer all, or that the infantryman will rise again and become the ultimate warrior, a la Suits, like they have at the end of... I don't know, what's that? What is that? What is that? Starship Troopers, yes, the end... Or they have the whole way through in the books, but, you know, that in the movies, they finally get them. Doesn't matter. If you're only prepared to accept a future which is only built around that one thing, you're automatically shutting down debate, but you're also shutting down conversation. You're shutting down the interplay between these different things. And that's where the problem comes in. So, have fun. I hope so. Started working even when I saw it. Started watching it work even when I saw it went live. Didn't know he drove such a wedge between the branch of the Army and Navy. Yeah. Look, let's be honest. He not only managed to drive wedges between them, he also managed to unite them. I still consider his greatest accomplishment in his entire life, the greatest feat he had accomplished, which was nearly a miracle in my mind. It's to make these four men actually agree with each other. Honestly, making these four agree with each other is a feat. It is a feat equivalent to landing people on the moon. It is amazing. It's also the fact that he does it in opposition and basically causes issues between them and successive generations of his equivalents in the army because of it is the problem. Well, again, Verdun, the Royal Navy did expect Stukas. This is the point I would like to make, and the US Navy. They all expected dive bombers. The trouble the Royal Navy had was, A, getting the RAF to allow them to train versus dive bombers, because despite the RAF having some light... Did you want me? Hello? Oh, hello. For... Dan's gone home. He by mistake. Don't worry. It's still alive, but yeah. Don't worry.
Okay. Right, okay.
Alright, I'll sort that out. I think my sister's mad with me. Anyway. Powered armor, yes. He was a true believer. And if we go back to what I was saying about the dive bombs, etc., there's a whole series of trouble the Royal Navy has. I think I worked as on British Naval Aviation in getting the Air Ministry around the idea of dive bombers. And that's the reason why you end up with the Skewer. Officially called a fighter, but actually a dive bomber. And supposed to be used as a fighter as well as a dive bomber, but let's be honest, was a dive bomber. The Royal Navy knew exactly what they were getting, and when people start going, well, the Skewer's not a very good fighter, it's not. It wasn't supposed to be. The Blackburn Rock was supposed to be. That was the sop to the Air Ministry. Turret fighter. No! Dan, just bring chocolates. Gluten-free ones, you'll be fine. I'm joking, but yeah. Gluten, dairy-free chocolates are the way to make my sister happy. Chocolates are... I find this is the universal in all my family. I'm not saying this is a shame for all women. I'm not anything like that. But in all the women in my family, there is one thing I've often found as my best method of preemptively, if I know I'm already in trouble before I get there. Bring chocolates. My master says, a better coordinating US Army and Navy could have made a major difference at Pearl, but definitely at Midway and other battles, with better equipped Army Air Force units equipped to attack ships. It would have been very helpful. Leslie Mitchell, one of the first questions I got asked when I went to Best Point, are you related to Billy Mitchell in the 1980s? Yeah. Saved by a fluff from my ignorance. Don't worry. It's fine. It's not ignorance. It's what happens. Gluten dairy-free chocolates, don't get me started. Look, as I've said before, my sister is one of those people who is truly allergic to them. She is allergic to gluten and dairy. It's due to her asthma. It's part of her allergies. And she can get really ill if she has them. I'm talking hospitalization ill levels. So we really are paranoid and look after her on that front. And that's one of the fun things, and one of the reasons why when we're moving, what we're getting is a property, as I've explained. It's going to have, basically, I'm getting a little house which is next to their house scenario, in that I have a lounge kitchen area downstairs and a couple of bedrooms upstairs and a bathroom. We're adding in a bathroom upstairs, etc. and all those things. And there's all sorts of things going on. Oh, frigate. I don't know. Family being family. Anyway. You do it once when it's an emergency, and then they think they can always demand it. But yeah, it's we have to take care of her. And yeah, so I've got my property and they've got theirs. Anyway, normally I do take more questions and things at the end, but I am going to say thank you very much for watching. I'm going to be on Discord in a bit, but I'm going to go sort out some issues. And yeah, it'll be fun. I hope you've enjoyed the time. I know usually I do at least 3 hours of these, but it's just going to be a little bit of a trip. I've got to quickly pop inside and sort it out. And what have we got coming up? Well, we have a video will be out tomorrow night. I'm not deciding what it's going to be. Saturday, of course, is last week's live. And Tuesday, it's Imperial Japanese... No, hang on, no, it's 845 Squadron. No worry about the stress. It's the stress isn't the problem. The stress is that my mum and sister are worrying about things, and yes, they are. Yeah, I go in once because there's my sister's fallen over and there's illness, and they're doing it again. Anyway, I will see you all. See you perhaps on Discord in a bit. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Bye, everyone. Thank you.